In August of 2005, a 63-year-old widow named Margaret Williams watched everything she had built over 4 decades disappear under 20 feet of muddy water in New Orleans, Louisiana. But what she discovered about herself in the aftermath would prove that sometimes our greatest storms reveal our most extraordinary strength. Hello, my dear friends. It's always such a joy to be here with you, sharing these stories that remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. You know, after all these years of living and listening to so many beautiful souls, I've learned that some of the most remarkable transformations happen not when life is smooth sailing, but when we're forced to navigate the roughest waters imaginable. I want you to do something for me. If this story touches your heart, please take a moment to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel so you'll be notified every time we share a new, inspiring story, and leave me a comment below. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment of what I'm about to share with you, because the ending of Maggie's story will absolutely move you to tears of joy. But before we begin today's story, I always like to share something special with you that might help. I've left some wonderful natural products in the description that have been such a blessing in my life and might help you too. These are products I personally use and recommend for various health concerns like sleep, joint comfort, energy, and overall wellness. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. Now let me tell you about Margaret Williams, though everyone who knew her called her Maggie. She was 63 years old, living in New Orleans, Louisiana, and she was a widow trying to keep her late husband's dream alive. You see, Maggie and her husband Robert had owned a small bakery called Williams Family Bread, right in the heart of the French Quarter for over 40 years. It wasn't just a business to them. It was their love letter to the community, their way of bringing sweetness and comfort to neighbors who had become like family. Robert had passed away just 2 years earlier from a heart attack, and Maggie was doing everything she could to honor his memory by keeping that little bakery running. Every morning at 4 a.m., she'd unlock those heavy wooden doors, tie her apron around her waist, and begin the sacred ritual of mixing dough, shaping loaves, and filling the air with the aroma of fresh bread that had been drawing people in for decades. The bakery was more than just her livelihood. It was her identity, her home, her connection to Robert's memory. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 4 decades. Robert in his white baker's hat covered in flour, regular customers celebrating birthdays with their special order cakes, neighborhood children who'd grown up getting free cookies when their parents weren't looking. That bakery held every precious memory of the life she and Robert had built together. But in late August of 2005, everything changed. Hurricane Katrina was approaching, and the authorities were urging everyone to evacuate. Maggie had lived through hurricanes before. They were just part of life in New Orleans. But something about this one felt different. The urgency in the weather forecasters' voices, the way her neighbors were packing up their cars with more than just overnight bags, the strange stillness in the air that felt heavy with foreboding. I can only imagine how torn she must have felt. My dear friends, here was a woman who had never spent a night away from her home in over 40 years, being asked to abandon everything she held dear based on the possibility of danger. The bakery needed her. She had orders to fill, regular customers who depended on their daily bread, a business that couldn't afford to close, even for a few days. But as the winds began to pick up and the rain started falling in sheets, Maggie made the hardest decision of her life. She packed a small suitcase with a few days' worth of clothes, grabbed the photo of Robert from her bedside table, locked up the bakery, and drove to her cousin's house in Texas. She thought she'd be back in a week, maybe 2 at most. She had no idea she was saying goodbye to her entire life. You know, as I share this with you, I'm reminded of my own experiences with loss and uncertainty. When my dear Harold passed away 15 years ago, I thought my world had ended. I couldn't imagine who I was supposed to be without him by my side. But sometimes, my loves, life has other plans for us. Plans we can't see when we're in the middle of the storm. The hurricane hit New Orleans on August 29th, 2005, and it was more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The levees broke, and water rushed through the city like a merciless flood, swallowing homes, businesses, and memories whole. Maggie watched the news coverage from her cousin's living room in Texas, her heart breaking a little more with each aerial shot of her beloved city disappearing under murky brown water. When she finally saw footage of the French Quarter, she knew. Even before she could make out her specific street, even before she could see where her bakery should have been, she knew that everything was gone. The building that had housed 4 decades of love, sweat, and dreams was completely submerged. The ovens that had baked tens of thousands of loaves of bread were underwater. The photographs on the walls, the recipes written in Robert's careful handwriting, the worn wooden counters where countless customers had shared their joys and sorrows. All of it was gone. But you know what struck me most about Maggie's story when I first heard it? It wasn't just that she lost her business or her home. She lost her sense of who she was. For 40 years, she had been the baker's wife, then the baker herself. She was the woman who knew exactly how Mrs. Rodriguez liked her coffee cake, who remembered every child's birthday, who could tell you the story behind every recipe in her collection. Without her bakery, without her community, without her familiar routines, who was Margaret Williams? The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months. Maggie found herself living in her cousin's spare bedroom in Dallas, a city that felt as foreign to her as the moon. She'd never been away from New Orleans for more than a vacation, and here she was, displaced, dependent, and completely lost. The Red Cross provided some assistance. Insurance companies were overwhelmed and slow to respond, and the future felt impossibly uncertain. I remember going through my own period of feeling lost and displaced, though in a different way. After Harold died, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The routines we'd shared, the plans we'd made, the dreams we'd cherished together. Suddenly, none of it made sense anymore. I understand that feeling of waking up each morning and not knowing who you're supposed to be or where you're supposed to go. Maggie spent hours watching the news coverage of New Orleans, seeing the devastation, the people in shelters, the slow and often inadequate response to the crisis. She felt guilty for being safe and housed while so many others were suffering. But she also felt helpless. What could one 63-year-old woman do in the face of such overwhelming destruction? The depression crept in slowly at first, then all at once. There were days when Maggie couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of everything she'd lost felt too heavy to bear. Her cousin was kind and patient, but Maggie could see the strain her extended stay was putting on the family. She felt like a burden, like she was imposing on people who had their own lives to live. Some nights, she'd lie awake staring at the ceiling of that unfamiliar room, holding the framed photo of Robert and wondering if this was how her story was supposed to end. She'd survived 63 years, built a life, loved deeply, and worked hard, only to lose it all to forces completely beyond her control. It felt cruel and senseless and utterly final. But here's what I want you to understand about Maggie, and about all of us, really. Sometimes when we think we've reached the end of our story, we're actually standing at the beginning of a completely new chapter. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a transformation waiting to happen. Capítulo 2. Now, don't you dare leave this video, my dear friends, because what Maggie discovered about herself in those dark months is going to touch your heart in the most profound way. The turning point came in November of 2005, almost 3 months after the hurricane. Maggie had been attending a support group for Katrina survivors at a community center in Dallas. Not because she wanted to, but because her cousin had gently insisted that she needed to get out of the house and be around other people who understood what she was going through. She'd been reluctant at first. The last thing she wanted was to sit in a circle with strangers and talk about her feelings. But that November evening, something shifted. As she listened to story after story of loss and displacement, she began to realize that her pain, while deeply personal, was also profoundly shared. There was Maria, a 45-year-old teacher who'd lost her classroom and all her teaching materials. There was James, a 70-year-old retired mechanic who'd lost the garage, where he'd worked for 50 years. There was Patricia, a young mother who'd lost everything while trying to keep her 3 children safe. What struck Maggie wasn't just the enormity of everyone's losses, but the resilience she saw flickering in their eyes even in the midst of their grief. These weren't just victims. They were survivors, and many of them were already talking about going back, about rebuilding, about refusing to let the storm have the final word in their stories. After that meeting, Maggie couldn't stop thinking about New Orleans. Not the New Orleans that had been destroyed, but the New Orleans that could be rebuilt. She started researching what was happening in the recovery efforts, reading every article she could find about which neighborhoods were coming back, which organizations were helping with the rebuilding process. What she discovered broke her heart and ignited something in her spirit at the same time. The recovery was happening, but it was slow and uneven. Some areas were getting attention and resources, while others, particularly the neighborhoods where working-class families and elderly residents lived, were being left behind. The people who needed the most help were often the ones who had the least access to it. And then she read something that changed everything. An article about volunteers who were coming to New Orleans to help with the rebuilding effort, but struggling to find decent, affordable meals while they worked. Many of the restaurants were still closed. The ones that were open were overwhelmed. And these volunteers, people who were giving their time and energy to help rebuild her city, were subsisting on fast food and whatever they could grab from convenience stores. That's when Maggie had what she later called her lightning bolt moment. She might not have a bakery anymore. She might not have a building or ovens or even a clear plan, but she still had her hands and her knowledge and her ability to feed people. And if there was one thing she knew how to do better than almost anything else, it was make food that nourished not just bodies, but souls. She called the Volunteer Coordination Office in New Orleans and asked a simple question. What if I came down and cooked for the volunteers? Not fancy meals, just good hearty food that would keep them going. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Yes, they needed someone like her. Yes, they could help her find a place to work. Yes, please come as soon as possible. Her cousin thought she'd lost her mind. Here was a 63-year-old woman who'd just lost everything, talking about moving back to a city that was still largely uninhabitable, to cook for strangers in conditions that would be challenging for someone half her age. Maggie, her cousin said, you don't even have a place to live there. You don't have a kitchen. You don't have anything. But Maggie had something her cousin couldn't see yet. She had purpose. For the first time since the hurricane, she felt like herself again. Not the lost, displaced version of herself who'd been drifting through someone else's life, but the real Maggie Williams. The woman who knew that feeding people was more than just providing nutrition. It was providing comfort, community, and hope. In December of 2005, Maggie packed her car with every pot, pan, and cooking utensil she could fit, said goodbye to her cousin's family, and drove back to New Orleans. What she found when she arrived was both worse and better than she'd imagined. The physical destruction was overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones, with houses sitting at odd angles, debris piled everywhere, and the smell of mold and decay still heavy in the air. But she also found something beautiful. People. People who'd come from all over the country to help rebuild. Young college students on winter break. Retired folks who felt called to serve. Construction workers donating their skills. Teachers and nurses and social workers who'd taken leave from their regular jobs to be part of the recovery effort. These weren't just volunteers, they were angels. And they were exhausted and hungry and working harder than anyone should have to work. Maggie found temporary housing in a FEMA trailer, a tiny cramped space that was nothing like the home she'd lost, but it was hers, and it was in New Orleans, and that was enough. The Volunteer Coordination Office had arranged for her to use the kitchen at a church that had been partially restored. It wasn't much. The building still bore the scars of the flood, with water lines visible on the walls and a persistent smell of dampness, despite all the cleaning. But it had working stoves and enough space for her to do what she needed to do. You know, my dear friends, there's something I want to share with you about starting over later in life. When I was younger, I thought reinvention was only for young people, that by the time you reached a certain age, you were supposed to have everything figured out and settled. But Maggie taught me something important. Sometimes the most authentic version of ourselves only emerges when everything else has been stripped away. That first morning in the church kitchen, as Maggie stood surrounded by unfamiliar equipment in a space that smelled nothing like her beloved bakery, she felt a moment of panic. What was she doing? How could she possibly feed dozens of volunteers with limited supplies and no help? But then she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered something Robert used to say. Maggie, love is the most important ingredient in any recipe. Everything else you can figure out as you go. So she started with what she knew. She made a big pot of red beans and rice, a New Orleans staple that could feed a crowd on a budget. She baked cornbread in whatever pans she could find. She made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the way construction workers needed it after 12-hour days of demolition and rebuilding. When the volunteers showed up for dinner that first night, tired and covered in dust and debris, their faces lit up in a way that reminded Maggie why she'd fallen in love with feeding people in the first place. It wasn't just about the food, though after days of cold sandwiches and vending machine meals, her home-cooked dinner probably tasted like heaven. It was about the care, the warmth, the sense that someone was looking out for them while they looked out for the city. "Ma'am," one young volunteer said to her, a college student from somewhere up north who looked like he was barely old enough to shave, "this is the best meal I've had since I got here. It tastes like home." And Maggie realized that's exactly what she was creating. Not just food, but home. Not just nutrition, but the kind of nurturing that helps people keep going when the work gets hard and the days get long. Word spread quickly through the volunteer community. "You have to go to Miss Maggie's for dinner," they'd tell newcomers. "She'll take care of you." Within a few weeks, she was regularly feeding 50 to 60 people a night. And on weekends, when more volunteers were in town, that number could double. But here's what's truly remarkable about Maggie's story, and why I wanted to share it with you today. She wasn't just feeding bodies, she was feeding souls. That church kitchen became a gathering place, a community center, a home away from home for people who'd left their own lives behind to help rebuild New Orleans. Volunteers would linger after dinner, sharing stories about their work, their frustrations, their small victories. They'd show pictures of their families back home, talk about why they'd felt called to come to New Orleans, share their hopes for what the city could become. And Maggie, stirring pots and refilling coffee cups and listening to all these conversations, began to understand something profound about her own calling. She'd always thought her gift was baking bread, but she was realizing that her real gift was creating the conditions for community to flourish. She was good at feeding people, yes, but she was even better at making people feel seen and valued and cared for. As winter turned to spring, Maggie's operation grew more sophisticated. She learned to coordinate with food banks and donation drives, She figured out how to prepare meals for different dietary needs and cultural backgrounds. She started teaching some of the regular volunteers how to cook alongside her, sharing not just recipes, but the stories behind them, the memories they carried, the love they represented. And slowly, gradually, she began to see her future taking shape. Not the future she'd planned, where she'd grow old running the same bakery in the same neighborhood, following the same routines, but a different future, one she could never have imagined, but that felt more authentically hers than anything she'd ever done before. The woman who'd thought her life was over at 63 was discovering that it was just beginning. Now, I want you to pause for just a moment and leave me a comment below about what you think is going to happen next in Maggie's story. What do you imagine she discovered about herself during this incredible journey of rebuilding? Because what happened next is going to absolutely amaze you. By the spring of 2006, something remarkable was happening in that little church kitchen. What had started as Maggie simply wanting to feed hungry volunteers had evolved into something much more significant. The volunteers weren't just coming for dinner anymore. They were coming for community, for connection, for the sense of belonging that Maggie had somehow managed to create in the midst of all that devastation. But Maggie was also noticing something that deeply troubled her. While the volunteer community was thriving, many of the longtime residents of New Orleans, particularly the elderly and those without family support networks, were struggling in ways that broke her heart. These were people who'd lived in the city their entire lives, who'd lost everything, just like she had, but who didn't have the resources or energy to start over the way she was learning to do. She'd see them at the grocery store, counting pennies to buy a can of soup for dinner. She'd pass elderly neighbors sitting on the steps of damaged houses, looking lost and forgotten. She'd hear stories about seniors who were so overwhelmed by the insurance paperwork and bureaucratic maze of rebuilding that they were simply giving up, accepting that they'd never be able to return to any semblance of their former lives. One evening in April, Mrs. Celestine Johnson came to the church kitchen. She was 78 years old, a retired school teacher who'd lived in the lower 9th Ward for over 50 years before Katrina destroyed her home. She'd been staying with relatives in different parts of the city, never in one place long enough to feel settled, never sure where she'd be sleeping from one week to the next. Mrs. Johnson was thin, too thin, and when Maggie handed her a plate of jambalaya and cornbread, she saw the older woman's hands shake slightly as she accepted it. "Miss Maggie," Mrs. Johnson said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in months. I keep meaning to cook for myself, but I don't have my own kitchen anymore, and I can't seem to remember how to make just one serving of anything. I've been cooking for my family for 60 years, and now I can't figure out how to cook for just me." That conversation changed everything for Maggie. She realized that while she'd been focused on feeding the volunteers who were rebuilding the city, there was another population that needed nourishment just as desperately. The longtime residents who were trying to rebuild their lives, but had nowhere to turn for the kind of care and community they'd lost. That night, Maggie lay awake in her FEMA trailer, thinking about Mrs. Johnson and all the other displaced seniors she'd encountered. She thought about her own experience of feeling lost and displaced, of not knowing who she was supposed to be without her familiar routines and community. She thought about how much the support group in Dallas had meant to her, how hearing other people's stories had helped her feel less alone. And that's when the idea began to form. What if she could create something that served both populations, the volunteers who needed nourishment to continue their rebuilding work, and the longtime residents who needed community and support to rebuild their lives? What if the church kitchen could become more than just a place to get a hot meal? What if it could become a place where people of all ages and backgrounds could come together, share their stories, learn from each other, and find the strength to keep going? The next morning, Maggie called the pastor of the church and asked if they could meet. She had an idea, she told him. But she needed to know if he'd be willing to support something bigger and more long-term than what she'd been doing. Pastor Williams, no relation, but they'd joked about sharing a last name, listened as Maggie outlined her vision. She wanted to create a program that would serve meals not just to volunteers, but to anyone in the community who needed nourishment and connection. She wanted to offer cooking classes where people could learn to prepare affordable, nutritious meals for their families. She wanted to create a space where the wisdom and experience of longtime residents could be shared with younger volunteers, where stories could be told and preserved, where the act of sharing food could become a bridge between different generations and backgrounds. "I want to call it Rising Bread," Maggie told the pastor, "because bread rises when you give it the right conditions, warmth, time, and care. And I think people rise the same way. They need warmth and time and care, and they need to know that someone believes in their ability to rise again." Pastor Williams was immediately supportive, but he also asked the practical questions that Maggie hadn't fully worked out yet. How would she fund something like this? How would she manage a program that served multiple populations with different needs? How would she handle the logistics of running what was essentially a small nonprofit organization? Maggie didn't have all the answers, but she had something more important. She had clarity about her purpose. "Pastor," she said, "I'm 64 years old. I lost everything I thought defined me. But in losing everything, I discovered something I never knew I had. The ability to create community around food, to help people feel valued and cared for, to turn a simple meal into something that feeds not just bodies but spirits. I don't know exactly how I'm going to make this work, but I know I have to try. You know, my dear friends, there's something I want to share with you here about following your calling later in life. Before we continue with Maggie's story, I always like to mention something that might help you on your own journey. I've left some wonderful natural products in the description that have been such a blessing in my life and might help you too. These are products I personally use and recommend for various health concerns like energy, mental clarity, and overall wellness. Things that become so important when we're pursuing new dreams and facing new challenges in our later years. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. What Maggie was describing to Pastor Williams wasn't just a meal program. It was a complete reimagining of what her life could be. She was talking about becoming an entrepreneur, a nonprofit leader, a community organizer. She was talking about learning skills she'd never needed before, taking on responsibilities that would have intimidated people half her age, stepping into a version of herself that she couldn't have imagined just a year earlier. But here's what I find so beautiful about Maggie's story. She wasn't trying to become someone completely different. She was trying to become more fully herself. All those years of running the bakery, of knowing her customers' preferences and remembering their stories, of creating a space where people felt welcome and valued. Those weren't skills she was leaving behind. They were skills she was expanding and applying in a new context. Over the next few months, Maggie threw herself into learning everything she needed to know to make Rising Bread a reality. She researched nonprofit law and tax requirements. She learned about food safety regulations and volunteer management. She studied grant writing and fundraising strategies. She reached out to other organizations in New Orleans that were doing community work to learn from their experiences and avoid their mistakes. It was overwhelming at times. There were days when the paperwork felt as daunting as the hurricane itself, when the bureaucratic requirements seemed designed to discourage rather than support community initiatives. There were nights when Maggie would sit in her tiny trailer, surrounded by forms and applications and budget spreadsheets, wondering if she was crazy to think she could pull this off. But then she'd remember Mrs. Johnson's shaking hands and grateful smile. She'd think about the young volunteer who'd told her that her meals tasted like home. She'd remember the conversations that happened around her dinner tables, the connections that formed between people who might never have met otherwise, the sense of hope and possibility that seemed to grow stronger each time people came together to share food and stories. By the fall of 2006, Rising Bread was officially incorporated as a non-profit organization, with Maggie as its executive director. The church had agreed to let them use the kitchen and fellowship hall on a permanent basis. Maggie had secured her first small grant from a foundation that supported hurricane recovery efforts. She'd recruited a board of directors that included Pastor Williams, Mrs. Johnson, 2 of the regular volunteers, and a local businesswoman who'd heard about the program and wanted to support it. The scope of Rising Bread's work expanded gradually but steadily. They continued serving dinner to volunteers and community members several nights a week. They added a weekly cooking class where people could learn to prepare healthy, affordable meals, particularly important for seniors living on fixed incomes and families trying to stretch food budgets in an expensive rebuilding economy. But perhaps most importantly, they created what Maggie called story dinners, monthly gatherings where longtime New Orleans residents would share their memories of the city before Katrina, their experiences during and after the storm, and their hopes for the future. These weren't just social events. They were acts of preservation, ways of ensuring that the history and culture of New Orleans wouldn't be lost along with the physical structures that had been destroyed. Maggie discovered that she had a gift for drawing stories out of people, for creating the kind of safe, welcoming environment where even shy or reserved individuals felt comfortable sharing their experiences. She learned to ask the right questions, to listen with her whole heart, to help people see the significance and beauty in their own life stories. One of the most moving story dinners featured Mr. Jerome Washington, an 82-year-old jazz musician who'd lost his house and his collection of vintage instruments in the flood. As he talked about the music that had filled his home for decades, about the sessions with famous musicians who'd come through New Orleans, about the songs he'd written but never recorded, Maggie watched the younger volunteers hanging on every word. After dinner, one of the volunteers, a 23-year-old from Minnesota who was working with Habitat for Humanity, approached Mr. Washington. "Sir," he said, "I play guitar, and I'd love to learn some of those songs you talked about if you'd be willing to teach me." Within a month, they'd organized a small fundraiser to buy Mr. Washington a new guitar, and he was giving informal music lessons to volunteers in exchange for help navigating the insurance paperwork for his house. These were the moments when Maggie knew she'd found her true calling. Not just feeding people, but connecting people. Not just providing services, but building community. Not just helping individuals, but weaving the social fabric of New Orleans back together, one shared meal at a time. As 2007 dawned, Maggie faced a challenge she hadn't anticipated: success. Rising Bread had grown beyond anything she'd imagined when she first started cooking for volunteers in that damaged church kitchen. They were serving over 200 meals a week, had a waiting list for their cooking classes, and were getting calls from other organizations asking if they could replicate the program in different neighborhoods. But with success came complexity. Maggie found herself spending more time on administrative tasks and less time doing what she loved most: cooking and connecting with people. She was 65 years old and working 12-hour days, managing budgets and staff schedules and board meetings and grant reports. Some days she barely had time to set foot in the kitchen, much less prepare meals with her own hands. One particularly overwhelming Tuesday in February, Maggie sat in her tiny trailer office. She'd converted half of her living space into Rising Bread's headquarters, staring at a stack of grant applications and feeling more exhausted than she had since those first dark months after Katrina. She was supposed to be writing a report for a major foundation that was considering a significant donation, but all she could think about was how much she missed the simple act of chopping vegetables and stirring pots and seeing people's faces light up when they tasted something delicious. That's when Mrs. Johnson knocked on her door. She'd become one of Rising Bread's most dedicated volunteers, helping with everything from food preparation to event planning, and she had a sixth sense for when Maggie was struggling. "Miss Maggie," she said, settling into the folding chair that served as visitor seating in the cramped space. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. What's troubling you?" Maggie tried to explain her dilemma. She was grateful for Rising Bread's success, truly grateful. But she was drowning in the business side of running a nonprofit, and she was afraid she was losing touch with the heart of what they were trying to do. "I got into this because I wanted to feed people and build community," she told Mrs. Johnson. "But lately, I feel like I'm spending more time writing about feeding people than actually doing it." Mrs. Johnson listened thoughtfully, then asked a question that changed everything. "Miss Maggie, what if the solution isn't for you to do everything, but for you to teach other people to do what you do? What if instead of trying to be the only cook, you became the teacher who creates other cooks? What if instead of being the only one who knows how to build community around food, you showed other people how to do it too?" It was such a simple idea, but it revolutionized how Maggie thought about Rising Bread's mission. Instead of trying to expand by opening more locations or serving more meals from their single kitchen, what if they expanded by teaching other people, both longtime residents and newcomers to the city, the skills and approaches that made their program work? Over the next few months, Maggie developed what she called the Community Kitchen Leaders Program. It was part cooking class, part nonprofit management training, part community organizing workshop. Participants learned not just how to prepare nutritious, affordable meals, but how to create the kind of welcoming environment that turned a simple dinner into a community-building experience. The first class included 12 participants, 6 longtime New Orleans residents who'd been displaced by Katrina, 4 volunteers who'd decided to make New Orleans their permanent home, and 2 young locals who'd grown up in the city and wanted to be part of the rebuilding effort. They met twice a week for 3 months, learning everything from knife skills and food safety to event planning and volunteer coordination. But the real curriculum was harder to define. Maggie taught them how to listen, really listen, to the stories people told while they chopped vegetables together. She showed them how to create traditions and rituals that made people feel valued and included. She helped them understand that feeding people was never just about food. It was about dignity, connection, and hope. The program's first graduate was Maria Santos, a 42-year-old mother of 3 who'd moved to New Orleans from Honduras several years before Katrina. Maria had been struggling to rebuild her life after the storm, working multiple part-time jobs and trying to keep her family together in temporary housing. But she'd always been an excellent cook, and she had a natural gift for bringing people together. With Maggie's mentorship and a small startup grant from Rising Bread, Maria launched Corazon Kitchen in the Algiers neighborhood, serving the growing Latino population that had come to New Orleans as part of the rebuilding workforce. She adapted Rising Bread's model to reflect her community's culture and needs, hosting dinners that featured traditional Honduran and Mexican dishes alongside New Orleans classics, creating a space where recent immigrants could connect with each other and with longtime residents. Watching Maria's program flourish was one of the most fulfilling experiences of Maggie's life. She realized that this was what true leadership looked like, not trying to do everything yourself, but empowering other people to discover and use their own gifts in service of something larger than themselves. By 2008, Rising Bread had trained 15 community kitchen leaders who were running programs in 8 different New Orleans neighborhoods. Each program reflected the unique character and needs of its community, but all of them shared the core values that Maggie had discovered in that church kitchen: that food is a universal language, that everyone has stories worth hearing, and that community forms naturally when people feel safe, valued, and cared for. The success of the Community Kitchen Leaders program caught the attention of organizations outside New Orleans. Maggie started getting invitations to speak at conferences about disaster recovery, and community resilience. Newspapers and magazines wrote articles about Rising Bread's innovative approach to rebuilding social connections in the aftermath of trauma. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. In 2009, the city of New Orleans honored Maggie with a Community Service Award, recognizing her contributions to the city's recovery and renewal. The ceremony was held at City Hall, and when Maggie walked up to accept the award, she saw faces in the audience that told the story of her journey. Mrs. Johnson and Pastor Williams, Maria Santos and Jerome Washington, dozens of volunteers who'd become friends, community members who'd become family. As she stood at the podium, looking out at all these people whose lives had intersected with hers in ways she could never have predicted, Maggie thought about the woman she'd been 4 years earlier, lost, displaced, convinced that her useful life was over. That woman couldn't have imagined standing in this place, being honored for work she'd never planned to do, surrounded by a community she'd helped create from scratch. When Hurricane Katrina took everything I thought I knew about my life, Maggie told the audience, I thought it was the end of my story. But what I learned is that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. Sometimes losing everything you think you need creates space for discovering everything you never knew you had. She talked about the volunteers who'd taught her that service is a form of love, about the longtime residents who'd shown her that resilience is a skill that can be learned and shared, about the young people who'd reminded her that hope is always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. I thought my gift was baking bread, she said, but I learned that my real gift was creating the conditions where community can rise. And the most beautiful thing about community is that it multiplies. Every person you touch has the potential to touch others. Every connection you help create can become the foundation for countless other connections. As the applause filled the room, Maggie felt Robert's presence so strongly. It was almost like he was standing beside her. She knew he would have been proud of what she'd built, not because it looked like the life they'd planned together, but because it was so authentically, completely her. But even as she celebrated this milestone, Maggie was already thinking about the future. At 67, she wasn't ready to slow down or step back. If anything, she felt like she was just hitting her stride, just beginning to understand the full scope of what was possible when you combined practical skills with passionate purpose. The woman who'd once thought her story was over was just getting started. As we reach the end of Maggie's incredible story, I want you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. When you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we share a new inspiring story like this one. And please, give this video a thumbs up if Maggie's journey has touched your heart the way it's touched mine. I'd love to hear in the comments what this story means to you and how it might inspire changes in your own life. By 2010, 5 years after Hurricane Katrina forever changed her life, Maggie Williams had become something she never could have imagined. A nationally recognized expert on community resilience and disaster recovery. But more importantly, she'd become the person she was always meant to be, even though it took losing everything for her to discover it. Rising Bread had evolved into something extraordinary. What had started as one woman cooking for volunteers in a damaged church kitchen had become a network of over 30 community kitchens across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Each location was run by graduates of the Community Kitchen Leaders Program, and each one adapted the basic model to serve their specific community's needs and cultural traditions. But Maggie's proudest achievement wasn't the number of locations or the thousands of people they served each month. It was the depth of transformation she witnessed in the people who became part of the Rising Bread family, both those who received services and those who provided them. Take Jerome Washington, the elderly jazz musician who'd lost his instruments in the flood. Not only had he rebuilt his music collection with help from Rising Bread volunteers, but he'd started a youth music program that taught traditional New Orleans jazz to teenagers from all over the city. His weekly concerts at Rising Bread events had become legendary, drawing people from across the metro area who came not just for the food, but for the authentic cultural experience he provided. Or consider Maria Santos, whose Corazon Kitchen had become a model for how immigrant communities could integrate into New Orleans' cultural fabric while maintaining their own traditions. Maria had been accepted into a small business development program and was planning to open her own restaurant, with Rising Bread providing ongoing mentorship and support. And then there was Mrs. Celestine Johnson, who at 85 had become Rising Bread's volunteer coordinator and unofficial historian. She'd started an oral history project that documented the experiences of Katrina survivors, ensuring that the stories of loss, resilience, and renewal would be preserved for future generations. Her gentle way of drawing stories out of people had made her one of Rising Bread's most valuable assets, but perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Maggie herself. The shy baker's widow, who'd once been afraid to speak up in community meetings, had become a confident public speaker who regularly addressed conferences and workshops around the country. She'd testified before Congress about the importance of community-based recovery programs. She'd consulted with disaster relief organizations in other parts of the world, sharing the lessons she'd learned about how food and fellowship could heal communities torn apart by trauma. In 2012, at the age of 70, Maggie was invited to speak at a major conference on aging and community engagement in Washington, D.C. As she prepared her remarks, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair in her cousin's spare bedroom to this platform where she could influence policy and inspire others to see aging not as decline, but as an opportunity for renewed purpose. I want to talk to you today about the difference between growing old and growing wise, she told the audience of researchers, policymakers, and community leaders. For too long, our society has treated aging as if it's primarily about loss of physical ability, loss of relevance, loss of productivity. But my experience, and the experience of hundreds of people I've worked with over the past 7 years, suggests something very different. She talked about Mrs. Johnson, who'd discovered leadership abilities in her 70s that she'd never known she possessed. She talked about Jerome Washington, whose music had found new audiences and deeper meaning in his 80s. She talked about the dozens of older adults who'd become community kitchen leaders, discovering that their life experience and hard-earned wisdom were exactly what their communities needed. What I've learned, Maggie said, is that the challenges that come with aging, the loss of familiar roles, the need to adapt to new circumstances, the opportunity to reflect on what really matters, these aren't just obstacles to overcome. They're invitations to become more fully ourselves, to discover aspects of our potential that we never had the time or space to explore when we were younger. She shared research showing that Rising Bread participants over 60 reported higher levels of life satisfaction, better physical health, and stronger social connections than their peers who weren't involved in community service. But these statistics, important as they were, couldn't capture what Maggie saw in people's eyes when they discovered they still had important contributions to make. We've created a culture that sees retirement as the end of productive life, she continued. But what if instead of retiring from something, we could retire to something? What if instead of winding down, we could wind up? What if the last third of life could be the most purposeful, the most authentic, the most impactful? The response to her speech was overwhelming. Universities invited her to guest lecture. Foundations asked her to consult on their aging initiatives. Other communities reached out for help adapting the Rising Bread model to their own contexts. But the invitation that meant the most to Maggie came from an unexpected source, the culinary school at the University of New Orleans. They wanted her to develop a course on community culinary leadership that would teach students not just how to cook, but how to use food as a tool for social change and community building. At 71, Maggie Williams became Professor Williams, teaching a new generation of culinary professionals that their skills could be about more than creating beautiful dishes for paying customers. They could be about nourishing communities, preserving cultures, and creating spaces where people could connect across lines of difference. Her students came from all backgrounds: recent high school graduates exploring career options, mid-career professionals looking for more meaningful work, and older adults who wanted to turn their passion for cooking into community service. What they all learned from Maggie was that food has the power to heal not just individual bodies, but entire communities. You know, my dear friends, this reminds me of something that's been so important in my own journey through these later years of life. Before I finish Maggie's story, I want to mention again those wonderful natural products I've left in the description. As we age and take on new challenges and purposes, maintaining our energy and overall wellness becomes so crucial. These products, I personally use and recommend, have helped me stay vibrant and focused as I pursue my own passions in these golden years. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. By 2015, 10 years after Katrina, Maggie's impact could be measured in ways that went far beyond statistics. Rising Bread's network of community kitchens had served over 2 million meals. But more importantly, they'd created gathering places where tens of thousands of people had found community, purpose, and hope. The Community Kitchen Leaders Program had trained over 500 people in community organizing skills, many of whom had gone on to start their own social enterprises or take leadership roles in other organizations. But perhaps Maggie's greatest legacy was the shift in how people thought about aging and community contribution. Through her example and her teaching, she'd shown that life's most difficult transitions could become opportunities for discovering new aspects of purpose and potential. She demonstrated that communities recovering from trauma needed not just young energy but elder wisdom, not just new ideas but experienced perspective. The recognition continued to come. In 2016, she received an honorary doctorate from Tulane University. In 2018, she was inducted into the Louisiana Women's Hall of Fame. But the honors that meant the most to her were simpler and more personal. The thank you notes from community kitchen leaders who'd found their calling through her program. The stories of communities that had healed and grown stronger through shared meals. The knowledge that she'd helped create something that would outlast her own involvement. Now, in 2025, at the age of 83, Maggie Williams continues to lead Rising Bread, though she's gradually transitioned from day-to-day operations to strategic planning and mentorship. The organization she started in a damaged church kitchen now operates in 12 states and has inspired similar programs around the world. Her book, Rising from the Storm: How Food and Fellowship Can Heal Communities, has become required reading in social work and community development programs. But ask Maggie about her proudest achievement, and she won't talk about the awards or the recognition or the impact statistics. She'll tell you about last month's story dinner, where a 22-year-old college student shared how Rising Bread had helped her family rebuild after losing their home in a fire, and how she was now studying social work so she could help other families navigate crisis and recovery. She'll tell you about Jerome Washington's great-grandson, who's carrying on his musical legacy and teaching jazz to a new generation of young people. She'll tell you about Mrs. Johnson, now 95 and still volunteering, whose oral history project has become part of the permanent collection at the Louisiana State Museum. She'll tell you about the letter she received last week from a woman in Puerto Rico who'd read about Rising Bread and was starting a similar program to help her community recover from Hurricane Maria. "Miss Maggie," the letter said, "you've shown us that disaster doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a better one. And that, my dear friends, is perhaps the most beautiful lesson of Maggie Williams' extraordinary journey. She learned that our greatest growth often comes not in spite of our most difficult experiences, but because of them. She discovered that the skills and wisdom we accumulate over a lifetime don't become irrelevant as we age. They become more precious, more needed, more powerful. Maggie's story reminds us that it's never too late to reinvent ourselves, never too late to discover new purposes, never too late to have the kind of impact on the world that makes all our previous experiences feel like preparation for this moment. She shows us that the storms of life, devastating as they can be, sometimes clear away everything that's not essential, leaving us with the clarity to see who we really are and what we're really capable of becoming. When Hurricane Katrina took away everything Maggie thought defined her, it gave her the opportunity to discover everything she never knew she had. The woman who thought her story was ending at 63 has spent the last 20 years writing the most meaningful chapters of her life. And the most beautiful part? She's not finished yet. At 83, Maggie Williams continues to rise, continues to grow, continues to show us all that our most authentic selves often emerge not when life is easy, but when life demands that we reach deeper than we ever thought possible. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, and the truth that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover that you had everything you needed inside you all along. If you've been touched by Maggie's incredible journey of transformation and renewal, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear this message of hope. Leave me a comment telling me what part of her story resonated most with you. I read every single one, and they mean the world to me. And remember, my dear friends, those natural products I mentioned are still available in the description below. Just as Maggie found new energy and purpose in her later years, these products can help support your own journey of wellness and vitality. Your support helps us continue sharing these inspiring stories that remind us all of the extraordinary potential that lives within ordinary people. Until next time, keep believing in the power of new beginnings, no matter what storms you may have weathered. Remember that your story isn't over. It might just be reaching its most beautiful chapters.